Despite dozens of lawsuits, Borat was never banned and pulled in $262 million. So how was that even possible? Sacha Baron Cohen, hidden behind that mustache and Borat's grey suit, was only pretending to be a fool. In reality, he was quietly running one of the riskiest experiments in the history of cinema. He mocked the hypocrisy of America and outsmarted its entire legal system, doing all of it right out in front of the entire world. At one point, the crew was being chased down by the police and even the FBI, but the comedy about this fictional Kazakh reporter made it into theaters anyway and became a massive box office hit. And 14 years later, Amazon paid $80 million for the rights to the second Borat film, which back in 2020 set off yet another huge international scandal. A luxury hotel, and inside it, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York and Donald Trump's personal lawyer. The moment he thinks the cameras are off, he heads to the bedroom with a young female reporter. Suddenly, Borat bursts into the room, screaming, "She's 15, she's too old for you." Giuliani, humiliated, leaps up off the bed, and the scene goes around the world. So let's look at what Borat was really about, and why a film like this could never get made today. Back in 2006, the world looked completely different. Political correctness was only just starting to ramp up. Facebook was in its infancy, and nobody had heard of cancel culture, the trend of publicly destroying people over one sentence or a joke most people didn't like. Comedy films back then often always walked a fine line on taste, and you only have to think of something like the Jackass franchise or Cohen's later film Bruno, which was also packed with provocation. But Borat stood out even against that backdrop, because it was a blend of satire and reportage. Cohen confronted ordinary Americans with the extreme character of Borat, a reporter from Kazakhstan who knew nothing of their customs. The result? Audiences laughed, but a lot of the people in the film, the real ones secretly caught on camera, felt humiliated and deceived. Protests were already breaking out before Borat even premiered. The government of Kazakhstan, for instance, officially condemned the film and threatened lawsuits, calling it an insult to the nation. And in many Arab countries, it was simply banned outright. Even so, Cohen walked away with a Golden Globe and an Oscar nomination, and most importantly, he set off a debate about the limits of satire. Today, it's hard to imagine a big studio daring to make a film like Borat. Every single controversial shot would instantly end up all over social media and set off a massive wave of public outrage and a full-blown boycott. Back in the year 2020, the second Borat film was made under Amazon's protective wing and shot entirely in complete secrecy. On set, strict procedures were in force, and the lawyers oversaw every single step right from the very beginning. Even so, a lawsuit still landed anyway. The daughter of a 98-year-old Holocaust survivor, for example, tried to block the film after her mother let Borat record her inside a synagogue. The court, however, threw the lawsuit out, ruling that the woman had signed all the proper consent forms. Back in 2006, nobody talked about cultural stigma, or at least it wasn't really at the center of our attention. Can you imagine a Western actor today drinking from a poor Romanian village, posing as Kazakhstan, or publicly humiliating random strangers? Most of the scenes in the first Borat were spontaneous reactions from people who had no idea what was happening. One of the most famous scenes happened at an elegant dinner hosted by plantation owners in the American South. Surrounded by ladies and gentlemen, Borat mixes up his words, insulting them as if completely by accident, openly comments on his host's appearance, and finally returns from the bathroom with a bag full of his own feces, asking the horrified hostess to clean it up for him. Funny enough, for a long time, nobody lost their temper. American politeness tells them to endure humiliation with a smile. So Cohen deliberately pushed it even harder, until he finally got thrown out of the house for bringing a prostitute to dinner. That one, by the way, was actually a planted actress. Another scene really worth noting is the rodeo in Virginia. Borat, dressed in a cowboy hat, stands in front of a crowd of 3,000 people and first delivers a patriotic speech, praising the war on terror and promising the Americans that Kazakhstan will finish off every last Iranian for them. The crowd cheers, even though what he's saying gets more and more wildly absurd. Only when Borat starts swapping in ridiculous lyrics over the US national anthem does the crowd turn furious, and the organizer says they'd better get out of there fast, before somebody shoots them. Cohen later said the crowd wanted to tear them apart, but the crew had already worked out an escape plan across the state line, just to avoid getting arrested. That's the clearest example of how deliberately they balance on the edge of comedy and catastrophe. The sharper the scene, the bigger the risk that someone calls the police, or that it even ends in a physical brawl. And the police really were called out dozens upon dozens of times. In one interview, Cohen openly admitted that during the Borat shoot, he got so used to the sight of cops on set that for a full 6 months afterward, just the sight of a patrol car gave him the sudden urge to run. All in all, the Borat crew was stopped or questioned by the authorities around 45 times over the entire course of filming. Cohen said that for quite a while, even the FBI was trying to figure out what this bizarre documentary actually was, and later on, the Secret Service joined them too. If Cohen had ever been arrested for any one of his stunts, the studio would have had to halt filming and the entire project could have collapsed. So the crew operated exactly like it was running a covert operation. They had escape routes mapped out, a lawyer on call, and a rule that they shot in any given place only once and then vanished fast. Producer Monica Levinson recalls that she ended up in custody while shooting a scene in a New York hotel. She spent over a dozen hours there, staying silent about the production, and when the officers started questioning her, they asked her flat out who this strange reporter of yours actually works for. Levinson answered calmly, sticking to what they had written in the official paperwork. His name is Borat Sagdiev, and he works for the state television of Kazakhstan. The fictional company One American Productions posed as a Kazakh television crew shooting a documentary about America, and everyone who appeared in the film signed their consent on exactly that basis. To the officers, it sounded like a bad joke. They asked if this wasn't some other character Cohen had played before, a parody of a British rapper and journalist. But Levinson kept right on denying it and stuck to the agreed-upon story right to the very end, saving both herself and the entire project. So why exactly did the people Borat met react so late? Why didn't those elegant guests he had dinner with throw him out after his very first insulting remark? And why did the entire rodeo crowd cheer along to xenophobic slogans? The answer lies in human nature and our fear of standing out from the crowd. Cohen deliberately played a foreigner, an immigrant from some exotic country who didn't know the customs. So a lot of people in the film tried to be polite hosts toward the newcomer. American courtesy here dictates that you don't make a scene and instead patiently explain everything step by step, and Borat exploits that to the maximum. In psychology, this is called the politeness norm. People will tolerate even bizarre behavior, just so they don't come across as rude. But there's a darker side to it, because Cohen was testing how much prejudice and nastiness hides just beneath the surface of this everyday human culture. Jay Roach, the producer of Borat, noted years later that the film really exposed what Americans truly think about immigrants. Things that back in 2006 nobody dared to say out loud. As a character, Borat is so extremely incorrect that the people around him feel at ease. And that's exactly why we get scenes where ordinary citizens deliver wildly racist or sexist remarks straight to the camera, never interrupting Borat. One example is the famous camper ride with 3 college students. In the presence of a naive foreigner, the guys loosen their tongues and start openly glorifying slavery and complaining that in the US, you can't be a real man anymore, because women have way too many rights of their own. The camera records everything, and later, to their shock and shame, that footage ends up in theaters. Cohen was also exposing human submissiveness to the camera, because if someone's making a documentary about America, the people on camera want to look as good or interesting as they can. Maybe they don't react so harshly because on the one hand, they're in total shock, but on the other hand, they know perfectly well they are being recorded. That's how Borat laid bare all the hypocrisy and prejudice of the system, of the culture we all live in. The people this happens to will often try hard to stay polite and calm, while at the same time letting absurd or downright awful things unfold. You could say that the real villain in this film isn't individual people at all, but the entire social mechanism. The false politeness, the legal cover, and the moral posture, we all hide our prejudices and shameful truths behind. For many years, Rudy Giuliani was considered one of the most respected politicians in the US. He had built the image of a moral, tough patriot. For years, he had talked about values, family, and ethics, which is exactly why the scene from the second Borat caused such a shock. Viewers watched Giuliani sit down on the bed with a young reporter and behave as if he absolutely wasn't doing this for the first time. The actress Maria Bakalova, who played the reporter, was actually 24 at the time. So, in reality, she was a legal adult, but in the film, she was styled to look like a naive young girl. Giuliani, of course, denied that he'd done anything improper. He claimed he was only adjusting his microphone, but the footage was impossible to dispute. The media wrote about the downfall of a man who, for years, had cast himself as a guardian of standards. Everyone wrote that this exact scene exposes the hypocrisy of power. But for Borat to pull that off, Cohen first had to prepare himself properly. Right from the production stage, every detail was meticulously planned, all overseen by a whole team of lawyers. As viewers, we might get the impression someone just filmed it spontaneously on a phone, but in reality, the budget for the first Borat came to $18 million, the second around $25 million. For comparison, a typical Hollywood film runs $150, sometimes even $300 million. But for a hidden camera comedy that looks like some amateur prank, Borat actually swallowed a serious amount of money. The first element of this shield was the image release forms, which everyone who appeared in the film had to sign. They were obtained under a certain pretext. The people in the scenes weren't told, of course. We're making a comedy where we get to make a fool of you. Instead, they used a fictional company and a cover story in which the participants believed they were taking part in a serious documentary for Kazakh television. They were led to believe the footage would only ever be shown somewhere far away, and definitely never in the US. The Guardian gives the example of the rodeo organizer who was told it was a film for Russian television and that the finished footage would only ever air in Belarus. All of it just to lull them into a false sense of security. The production even built fake websites to back up the credibility of these fictional broadcasters and foundations. People baited this way happily signed all the documents, and that document, though short, supposedly only 2 pages long, was remarkably effective. It contained a handful of key clauses that practically guaranteed the creators total impunity. First, the participant agreed to appear in a film in a documentary style, and understood that their statements could be used in a broader edit, in a different context than they imagined. That matters because people thought it was a documentary, but nowhere was it ever promised that the film would be a real one. The phrase documentary style deliberately blurred all of that. Second, the signer waived every possible claim. The contract spelled out that they wouldn't sue for defamation, invasion of privacy, image rights, and so on. They also waived any rights to the film's profits. Third came a full assignment of rights. The participant handed the creators the right to use the recorded footage, their likeness and their words in any way at all, including in promotional materials. This protected the studio from the accusation that, say, the film's trailer violated someone's rights by featuring a face supposedly loaned only for the film and not for advertising. And finally, fourth, the contract included a choice of law clause. Every dispute was to be settled by a court in New York under the law of New York State. A very clever move, because New York is famous for its fairly liberal approach to free speech and the media. And on top of that, it made it much harder for residents of far-off states to file lawsuits in their own local court, where the judges might lean their way. A consent form built like this is an absolute legal masterpiece. It's precisely why not a single person in the film ever won in court. They all believed they'd been deceived about the nature of the production. And that was the truth. But they had signed contracts in which, in black and white, they waived the right to any claims whatsoever, even if the film turned out to be something completely different from what they'd been told. So anyone who wanted to sue the creators first had to prove the signature itself was invalid, that it had been obtained by deception, and that was practically impossible. The second line of defense was the insurer. Fox Studios took out errors and omissions liability insurance. A policy like that protects the producers and the distributor in the event of claims, for example, over defamation or invasion of privacy. But for a company to even be willing to grant insurance like that, the film has to go through a detailed legal audit. The lawyers first have to confirm that everyone in the film signed valid consent forms, that the copyright to any material used is secured, and that the film contains no elements at all that would very likely end in a lost court case. Before Borat ever reached theaters, the lawyers spent long hours cleaning up every single shot. Anywhere the crew hadn't gotten consent, faces were covered or names were changed. Take, for instance, the scene in the antique shop, where Borat smashes a piece of antique porcelain.
Przepraszam.
Cohen covers all the damages, and that wasn't just a gesture of courtesy, but above all, a legal safeguard, so that nobody could accuse the crew of vandalism. When the first lawsuits started rolling in, the lawyers could sleep soundly, because they held both the participants' consent forms and a policy covering the costs of any courtroom battles. So how much did all of this cost? We don't know the exact figure, but industry analysts estimate that the spending on lawyers and insurance for such a risky project could have swallowed up several $1,000,000. Sacha Baron Cohen joked in one interview that his films have the biggest legal budget in all of Hollywood. And there's something to that. For instance, after Bruno, Cohen's next provocative comedy, the studio Universal reportedly set aside a reserve of $42 million to cover any potential claims, though in the end most of it went unused. The effectiveness of all these legal maneuvers is best seen by looking at the lawsuits against Borat and how they ended. Let's start with those camper students we mentioned. Right after the film premiered in 2006, two of them sued the studio and the producers. They claimed they'd been gotten drunk before filming and manipulated with a promise that the film would never reach the US. They demanded their scene be cut from theaters and DVD, plus damages for their ruined reputation. Their lawyer argued that because of this film, one of the guys lost his corporate job and the other a prestigious internship. And how did the court react to that? It threw the motion out in a flash, ruling there was no chance the students could win the case. Judge Joseph Biderman stated that the plaintiffs had voluntarily signed the contract, and the argument that they were drunk, so they didn't know what they were doing, didn't sway him in the slightest. What's more, according to Reuters, the appeals court ordered them to additionally cover the legal costs, so not only did they not win a single cent, they had to pay for the other side's lawyers too. The second high-profile lawsuit was filed by the residents of the Romanian village of Glod, which in the film posed as Borat's Kazakh village. They were outraged at being portrayed as primitive peasants, pimps, prostitutes, and thieves. Two residents, including a disabled grandfather who was shown in the film with a sex toy prosthetic for an arm, demanded $30 million in damages and the removal of their scenes from the film. They claimed they had been deceptively recruited and told it was a documentary about fighting poverty, paid a token few dollars, and now they feel humiliated in front of the whole entire world. Unfortunately, the residents achieved nothing either. Fox Studios argued that nobody had promised the residents a documentary in the legal sense, and that the village had simply served as a film set for a satirical picture, meaning everyone knew a film was being shot. They got paid, so their grievances have no basis. This case dragged on a little longer because the lawyers brought it to a federal court in the US and then even tried in Europe. But ultimately, in 2008, a judge in New York dismissed the Glod villagers' lawsuit on formal grounds. He ruled that the allegations had been insufficiently substantiated and that the residents had no legal grounds whatsoever to sue an American studio. The village's attorneys tried one more time, but Fox simply outlasted them. The legal odyssey dragged on, and the residents ran out of money. They never received a single penny. They told the press later that with the millions they hoped to win, they dreamed of running water lines through the village and opening a small processing plant to give people work, but that changed nothing either. There were other lawsuits too. A New York financier, for example, sued over being shown fleeing in a panic when Borat tried to hug him on the street. He claimed his image rights had been violated and that he'd suffered public humiliation. The court, however, ruled that the scene was a form of social satire and dealt with matters of public interest, Americans' attitudes towards strangers, so all of it falls within legally protected creative work. The lawsuit was dismissed, and the judge conceded that the film may well be vulgar, but it has social value. Kathie Martin from Alabama, who taught Borat good table manners, also felt deceived. Along with several other people, she filed a class action lawsuit demanding damages for humiliation and loss of reputation. The outcome was the same as before. She had signed the contract, and the court ruled that simply feeling embarrassed doesn't mean the law was broken. Every single trial ended in a win for Borat. What's more, years later it turns out that the creators had gone on the counterattack. Fox's lawyers started seeking reimbursement of their costs from the very people who'd sued. And that's exactly when people wrote that Fox had turned Borat's victims into a source of profit, effectively saddling them with its own lawyer bills. It's hard to find a more striking proof that the US legal system stood firmly on Cohen's side. His film, controversial as it was deemed a legal work of art, falling squarely within the right to satire and freedom of expression. Kazakhstan itself never ultimately sued Cohen, though at first, as I mentioned, there were threats of lawsuits, and in Britain and the US they even shut down the official Borat website. Instead, the Kazakh government spent millions on a campaign meant to warm up the country's image. Among other things, it bought a 4-page ad in the New York Times that praised Kazakhstan as a modern nation. President Nazarbayev complained to George W. Bush about Borat. That conversation really did happen at a summit in Washington back in 2006. But from a legal standpoint, there were no grounds whatsoever for any claims. After all, Cohen never used any real footage from Kazakhstan. The film takes place in the US and the Kazakhstan in it is completely fictional, shot in Romania. So there was simply nobody to sue here for any concrete damages, and paradoxically, years later, the Kazakh authorities admitted that Borat had actually helped tourism. Back in 2020, Kazakhstan slyly adopted the slogan "Very nice" as the country's official promotional tagline.
Great success.
Dan Mazer, the co-writer, recalled the famous fight scene, where Borat and Azamat, played by the actor Ken Davitian, burst stark naked into a conference hall packed with people. The lawyers spent a long time hunting for the right place where they could pull off a scene like that without it ending in a lawsuit. In the end, they picked Dallas. As it happened, a convention of mortgage advisors was being held there, and the local law gave them the best odds that nobody would drag them to court. And sure enough, they managed to film the scene. And when the security guards wrestled Davitian down, completely naked, and shoved him into a police van, it all went off without a single lawsuit. The actor spent just 45 minutes in custody and was let go. Cohen had managed to escape the hotel, so they never caught him at all. Just picture the faces of the people who appeared in Borat and then saw themselves on TV, saying things on camera they would normally never say out loud. Many of them felt anger and humiliation. There are some, though, who took the whole situation with humor and a sense of distance. Take, for example, the driving school owner from the film, who taught Borat to drive and patiently explained that in the US, you can't drink alcohol behind the wheel or run over gypsies. He did initially join one of the class action suits, but later pulled out and admitted that all things considered, it's pretty funny.
2 hands.
But then it looked like I am holding a gypsy while he eats my crumb.
I don't care what it looks like.
I like you. Do you like me?
I do like you.
You are my friend?
You're a nice young man and I am your friend.
You will be my boyfriend.
Yeah, I won't be your boyfriend.
Why not? You do
Well,
not
I
like
can be.
me?
Yeah, I can be. No boyfriend. Yeah, I can.
Why are you gay?
For Cohen himself, the consequences of this film cut both ways, because professionally, he'd scored a huge victory. But privately, it was a real threat. He admitted that for a while, he genuinely feared for his safety, and he had good reason to. Time and again, he received anonymous letters with threats. He'd also grown too recognizable to keep running experiments like this in the US, so he announced he would never play Borat again, because it was simply impossible. For years he kept that promise, right up until 2020. On the set of the second Borat, he already had to take far greater precautions. In one of the scenes, he played a country singer and performed at a rally. He sang about injecting Obama with the virus, and the crowd sang right along with him until the organizers caught on that it was a provocation. Cohen recounted that it was the first time he wore a bulletproof vest on set. He had it on under his costume, because a lot of people at that rally were armed. When the crowd rushed the stage, Cohen fled to a van. Furious people surrounded the car, started pounding their fists on the windows, and somebody even ripped a van door off and tried to drag him out, but the driver managed to get away. I thought it was the end. I was lucky to get out alive. That's how the actor later described it in interviews. In another incident, the Borat 2 crew was recognized and chased down the highway by armed QAnon fanatics, a group that believed Trump was their savior and would destroy a secret network of elites controlling the media and the world. Situations like this show that Borat was a very real danger and that Cohen was risking his health and maybe even his life. His wife, also an actress, Ayla Fisher, said in an interview that she experienced every one of Sacha's outings as if he were heading off to the front line. Despite these dangers, Borat's impact on the film industry and pop culture was enormous. After its 2006 premiere, a lot of creators tried to repeat the formula, and films like Bad Grandpa with Johnny Knoxville appeared, weaving sketches with real people's reactions into a storyline. It was a clear Borat style, though far less political. Prank shows on TV also caught on, and YouTube was flooded with hidden camera channels. But nobody achieved what Cohen did, because nobody pushed so far in exposing serious prejudice under the cover of a joke. Borat set the bar and tore it down at the very same time, because after Borat everybody knew the trick. Satirical provocations became a whole lot harder, because a lot of people started getting suspicious the moment anything strange happened around the camera. Cohen himself back in 2018 also launched his own show, Who is America, where in fresh disguises he tricked American politicians and celebrities. In one of the episodes, posing as an Israeli counter-terrorism expert, he convinced Republican lawmaker Jason Spencer that the best way to scare off a terrorist is to strip down and scream with your pants pulled down. And Spencer actually did it. He ran around the set naked, waving his backside and shrieking into the camera. No wonder a scandal erupted after the episode aired, and the politician had to give up his seat. The show, once again, set off shock and an avalanche of legal reactions. The politician Roy Moore, known from earlier scandals, sued Cohen for an astronomical $95 million over the suggestion that he has a thing for the very youngest. I don't know how else to put this so YouTube doesn't block me, but I think you all get what I mean. During the interview, Cohen waved a fake detector for such people near him, which of course beeped. A judge in New York ruled in 2021 that the segment was obviously a joke no reasonable viewer would take literally, and that the contract Moore had signed ruled out any claims whatsoever. Same exact playbook as with Borat. Cohen wins even against seasoned politicians and lawyers, which is the best proof of just how brilliantly prepared he is for all of this. You could even speak of a Borat effect in the media, meaning the courage to tackle controversial subjects under the cover of comedy. After its success, critics came to appreciate that satire can carry social value, and the film even landed on lists of the most important comedies of the 21st century, because beyond the laughs, it left a lasting mark on the conversation about tolerance. Just as in 2006 we all laughed at it together, by 2020 a part of the audience no longer could. Conservatives accused Cohen of propaganda and of mocking only one side of the political aisle, and suddenly Borat became a piece of the culture war. Just like every piece of satire that shows anything at all today, because all it takes is for something to make us laugh or to sting, and right away we slap a political label on it. That shows just how much we've changed since then. The modern joke that hits a sore spot runs into not only legal resistance, but exactly the social kind too. South Park has been balancing on the edge of lawsuits for years. The studio's lawyers once had to explain to the creators that they couldn't show the Prophet Muhammad because they were risking not so much a lawsuit as an actual attack. Dave Chappelle, the famous comedian, wasn't sued over his jokes about transgender people, but Netflix employees staged a walkout to pull his show off the platform. Platforms are terrified of scandals these days. They'd rather cut the controversial bit, throttle the reach, or never let the material air at all. And that's what our modern self-censorship looks like today. Supposedly, nobody's forbidding us anything, but everybody knows perfectly well what not to touch. And that leads us to the absurdity I talked about, for instance, in another video. Because today, say, an overweight person can feel offended that someone is simply working out, and online there'll always be bands of people ready to make a whole scandal out of it. On YouTube, at worst, they'll cut your reach, block monetization, and you'll waste a lot of work, because the material won't reach the viewer. It's annoying, of course, but nobody's going bankrupt over it. At the film studios, the stakes are already millions of dollars, which is why, out of pure common sense, they'd simply rather avoid risky subjects, and the result is that cinema has become safe, correct, and utterly without character. Jeffrey Epstein, a man who owned no company, inherited no fortune, and yet still left behind $577 million. In 2019, he was found dead in his cell. Officially a suicide, but a string of coincidences and his connections to politicians and billionaires raised the question, was it really chance that he never got to testify? Click the thumbnail and see what really happened. This is Cold Lemon. Thanks for watching and see you again in just a moment.